You're not a novice to this issue. Okay, let's go. Mike Tabor, thank you.
First of all, thanks to the Online Communist Forum for inviting me to kick off the discussion here today. I hope participants will find it of interest. I'll be taking up 5 things. 1, the conflicted appreciation of the Second International and its legacy. 2, what the Second International was. 3, debates that took place within it. 4, the book I prepared of Second International resolutions from 1889 to 1912. And 5, the relevance of all this today. Chronologically, the Second International obviously comes before the Third, but in my case, it was the other way around. As some of you may know, for years I've worked on an ongoing project to edit and publish the record of the Communist International in Lenin's time, in collaboration with John Riddell. In the process of working on these books, I would frequently come across references to Second International resolutions, which then had to be tracked down and sourced. In the process, I saw how difficult it was to even find some of them. So a few years ago, it occurred to me that it would be a worthwhile project if these resolutions could all simply be collected together and made available as a resource, nothing more. But as I got into it, I realized there was much more involved. In particular, there were deeper issues to think about concerning the Second International's place within the continuity of Marxism. One thing that struck me as curious was that the resolutions adopted by the 9 Congresses of the Second International between 1889 and 1912 had never before been assembled altogether and published in English. How could this be, I wondered, in light of the fact that virtually all currents in the world today claiming to be socialist acknowledged the Second International during those years as part of their legacy? This was a riddle, and it called for an answer. One obvious answer is that the social democratic parties of the post-1919 Second International were not interested in doing so, and for good reason. Following the First World War and continuing over the next century, social democratic parties headed the government in many countries, as you in Britain know well. In 1919, many left-wing socialists wavered on whether to seek to rebuild the Second International or to construct an entirely new world movement. To these wavering elements, supporters of the Comintern repeatedly stressed the Second International's betrayal and the need for a definitive break within it. Emphasis was placed on the need to turn one's back entirely on what had become a bankrupt organization that stood in the way of the struggles by the working class. Ever since then, generations of socialist activists have felt there was little value in seriously studying the work of the Second International. Here I'll speak for myself. When I was first coming to the revolutionary Marxist movement 5 decades ago, and for years after that, I had absolutely no interest in studying the Second International. Why should I? As I saw it, this was an outfit that had betrayed the working class, that supported the bourgeoisie in World War I, that was responsible for the murder of Luxembourg and Liebknecht, and that had committed untold other crimes. Why in the world would I want to take the time to go back and study the resolutions of its early years? While that sentiment may be understandable, the conclusion is entirely unwarranted. For one thing, downplaying the legacy of the Second International's revolutionary period means cutting oneself off from an important part of the movement's history and the lessons to be learned from it. But there's another reason, perhaps more important. Ignoring the Second International's legacy also means ceding that legacy to those who don't deserve it, to social democratic currents that openly abandoned Marxism long ago. But the best of this legacy legitimately belongs to us, to revolutionary socialists and communists. The left-wing leaders who broke with the Second International after its betrayal of 1914, such as V.I. Lenin and Rosa Luxembourg, were not sparing in invectives to describe the stinking corpse that the Second International had become. In making these political attacks, however, Lenin and Luxembourg never renounced the resolutions the Second International had adopted. Quite the contrary. During the years of the First World War, for example, they constantly referred to the best of these resolutions, particularly the resolutions on militarism and war, to illustrate the extent to which the Second International's majority leaders were violating these resolutions in practice. What Lenin and Luxembourg criticized above all was the Second International's gap between word and deed, its sheer hypocrisy. There's another point that has to be considered when thinking about this question. Frederick Engels, the co-creator of Marxism. If you read his correspondence, such as volume 48 of the Marx Engels collected works, you'll see that Engels not only worked tirelessly to help found the Second International, but for the first 6 years of its existence, he was probably its most important advisor, and he gave general support to its decisions and resolutions. So any effort to belittle the Second International's legacy, certainly in its early years, is by extension a criticism of Engels himself. This is one of several reasons why I don't like an expression that you'll sometimes come across: Second International Marxism. If such a Marxism existed, you'd certainly have to call Engels a Second International Marxist, wouldn't you? So the expression is problematic on that front. I simply don't think it's helpful. It confuses more than it clarifies. But there's a more important problem with the term Second International Marxism. It implies that we're dealing with a special and inferior version of Marxism, one that may be of interest to scholars or archivists, but which has little relevance to anyone else. However, as Ben Lewis correctly pointed out in his fine presentation on Kautsky given here a few months ago, this was the Marxism that trained Lenin, Luxembourg, Trotsky, and virtually all the other leaders of the early communist movement. So just what was the Second International? From its beginning in 1889, the Second International was a loose association of widely divergent forces with differing perspectives and expectations. As an aside, it should be pointed out that in the period we're dealing with, no formal name existed for the International. The label Second was given to the movement merely to distinguish it from the First International of Marx and Engels, whose formal name was the International Workingmen's Association. Sometimes it was also called the Socialist International. The movement included in its ranks both political parties and trade unions. A few of the political organizations were mass parties. Others were small propaganda groups. Some of these forces had clearly defined Marxist programs. Others still bore traits of pre-Marxist brands of socialism, with a multitude of conflicting perspectives, such as anarchism and syndicalism. Some currents were revolutionary in outlook, others were not. The three largest contingents of the Second International were: one, those in Germany, with a mass social democratic party and large trade unions that looked to that party. Two, Britain, with a number of relatively apolitical trade unions and a wide assortment of small socialist organizations. And three, France, with strong revolutionary traditions, but with the movement divided into opposing political currents. The Second International's affiliates in different areas faced a wide variety of social and economic situations. Some countries, like Germany and Britain, were industrial powers with a well-developed proletariat. Other countries had primarily agrarian economies, with a large peasantry and a small working class. Some countries where socialists lived had ruling classes that possessed colonial empires. Other peoples lived under the boot of colonialism and imperialism. State repression against socialist parties ranged from intermittent harassment to the imposition of total bans. As a result of all these differences, prevailing political cultures within the movement varied considerably. In the quarter century of its existence before World War I, the Second International had a number of important accomplishments to its credit. Perhaps its greatest accomplishment was to unify the international working class movement under the banner of Marxism. And it helped disseminate and popularize the movement's stated aim: the revolutionary overturn of the capitalist ruling class and its replacement by the rule of the proletariat as a first step toward the establishment of socialism. The founding Congress in 1889 laid out the revolutionary goal of the movement, affirming, quote, that the emancipation of labor and humanity cannot occur without the international action of the proletariat, organized in class-based parties, which seizes political power through the expropriation of the capitalist class and the social appropriation of the means of production. The Second International of those years was, in its adopted resolutions, an irreconcilable revolutionary opponent of the capitalist system. While it championed the fight for reforms in the interests of working people, the 8-hour day, state-sponsored insurance and pensions, public education, votes for women, the right to asylum, and many other reform measures, it rejected the idea that capitalism as a system was reformable. It called for the working class to take political power and expropriate the capitalist owners of the major industries. It insisted that the working class itself was the agent of its own emancipation. And it defended the interests of all the oppressed and exploited around the world. Two dates on the calendar today owe their existence to the Second International. May Day, established at the movement's founding Congress in 1889 as a demonstration of working class power and solidarity around the world, and International Women's Day, established in 1910 as a worldwide day of action for working women in the fight for full social and political rights. The Second International showed the potential power of the organized working class. It's been estimated that in the years before 1914, the Second International counted 10 to 12 million members affiliated to its national sections, with over 50 million sympathizers and voters. Numerous socialist representatives and deputies sat in national parliaments and in regional and local legislative bodies. For many workers, these signs of strength gave them confidence that a revolutionary transformation of society was possible in the not too distant future. But behind this real and potential power were significant weaknesses and contradictions. For one thing, the Second International was simply a federation of national parties and trade unions. The International possessed moral authority and made decisions on broad policy and strategy to be put into practice by its affiliates. There was a positive side to this type of structure, particularly in the Second International's early years as the movement consolidated itself politically. In these years, Engels himself opposed efforts to create a strong executive bureau, given the likelihood that such a body would fall under domination, the domination of various reformist currents. But the lack of such a structure came to be a serious weakness over time. No mechanism existed for implementation of the International's decisions, even after the 1900 creation of the International Socialist Bureau as the movement's executive body. Resolutions were often not put into practice. In the derisive words of Grigory Zinoviev and other leaders of the early communist movement, the Second International functioned essentially as a mailbox. That was the term. Such an appreciation was undoubtedly exaggerated and unfair, given that parties of the Second International regularly did carry out important internationally coordinated actions during this period. It should be recognized, however, that these actions were generally organized on a party-to-party basis without any real central control or coordination, even compared to that of the General Council of the First International decades earlier, under the leadership of Marx and Engels. Another weakness involved its geographic focus. Even though its reach extended to many countries, the Second International was still predominantly a European and North American movement. While Congress resolutions gave support to anti-colonial struggles, most sections of the movement still had an underappreciation of them. Moreover, the Second International never became a truly world movement. The only countries outside Europe, North America, and Australia that were ever represented at Second International Congresses during the 1889 to 1912 period were Argentina, Japan, South Africa, and Turkish Armenia. Related to this, the International's resolutions often lacked an adequate appreciation of the strategic allies the working class would need in its struggle, from toilers in the colonial world to working farmers and peasants, small shopkeepers, victims of national oppression, and others. Finally, even though it called for the revolutionary replacement of capitalism, the Second International as a whole lacked a clear perspective on the role of revolutionary action in such a transformation. The relationship between reform and revolution was a point of friction and debate. An openly opportunist and reformist wing within its parties steadily grew. Above all, the Second International was characterized by the gap between word and deed that I referred to earlier. This gap and the growing divergences within it grew into a chasm in 1914 with the onset of the First World War. In clear violation of all the Second International's resolutions, the main parties of the Second International renounced their past pledges and lined up behind their government's war efforts. Millions of workers and others were sent to their deaths with the support of these parties. The betrayal of 1914 marked the political death of the Second International. Even though it was formally reconstituted in 1919, the new body lacked even the pretense of being a revolutionary movement. It consisted instead of open supporters of capitalist regimes and die-hard opponents of the post-war revolutionary upsurge that developed in the wake of the Russian Revolution. I'll turn now to a few of the issues and debates that these resolutions highlight. These debates help show the significance of the Second International and why its resolutions deserve study today. In the Second International's first few years, the two most debated items were anarchism and the general strike. Anarchists were a major current in the workers' movement during the late 19th century, unlike today, where its appeal is primarily to a layer of youth. Marx and Engels devoted considerable attention to the debate with the anarchists in the First International, above all with the anarchist leader Mikhail Bakunin. A central tenet of anarchist ideology was to reject all forms of political action, including participation in elections and the fight for political reforms and social legislation. There were relatively few anarchists who participated as delegates in Second International Congresses, but they constantly raised objections to political action, making their presence known through noisy disruptions of the proceedings. To prevent these disruptions, in 1891, a resolution on conditions of admission to the Congress was adopted that called for recognition of political action as a precondition for attending international congresses. Similar resolutions were approved in 1893 and in 1896, at which time anarchists were definitively placed outside the International. The whole thing actually didn't arouse much controversy. The question of the general strike, however, was more complex. This was a point of contention at numerous congresses. This issue was generally put forward by French delegates influenced by syndicalism, an ideology that saw unions as the essential instrument for revolutionary change. Many syndicalists viewed the general strike as the ultimate and surefire working class weapon, above all to combat the threat of war. They elevated it almost to a religious level. Their overestimation of the potential of a general strike, however, was met by an opposite tendency to dismiss even the possibility of such a strike. Much of this opposition to the general strike came from the German trade unions and their defenders in that country's Social Democratic Party. German unions were expanding rapidly at the time, along with a growing bureaucracy within them. Given the precarious legal situation then facing the working class movement in Germany, the German unions were afraid that such strikes could lead the government to outlaw them. One way this question came up was around May Day. As I mentioned, the founding Congress of the Second International in 1889 endorsed an initiative by the American Federation of Labor to set May 1st the following year as a day for demonstrations and strikes by working people around the world. From then on, May Day became a day to demonstrate the strength and solidarity of the international working class movement. Debates on May Day occurred at a number of congresses. The German and British trade unions and parties, in particular, were opposed to calling for strikes on May Day, preferring instead to schedule parades and rallies on the first Sunday in the month. Compromise resolutions were adopted at international congresses calling for strikes and demonstrations on May 1st where possible, but leaving the matter for ultimate decision by organizations in each country. These two issues, anarchism and the general strike/May Day, were the most debated points of the early years of the Second International and its first four congresses. During those years, the discussions in the Second International were, as a whole, somewhat similar to those of the First International a few decades earlier. But starting in 1900, the subjects of debate started to shift as the rise of imperialism altered the entire world political context. For this reason, the issues and debates at the Congresses from 1904 on especially are closer to what we face today. I'll mention a few of these issues. One important issue of debate concerned political power, essentially the question of reform and revolution. The question of political power was a theme of many of the resolutions adopted at Second International Congresses. Resolutions stressed that every major issue facing working people was inextricably tied to the question of political power and the need to replace domination by capitalists and landlords with the rule of working people. In this spirit, it was generally assumed by the Second International that workers needed their own independent party and that no political support was to be extended to the capitalist class or its parties. And while the working class fights aggressively for reform measures, the resolution stressed the capitalist system as a whole was unreformable. A revolutionary transformation of the entire social order was necessary. This became a subject of debate specifically around the question of socialist participation in capitalist governments and relations with bourgeois parties. The background of this goes back to 1889 when French socialist Alexandre Millerand accepted a position as minister in the capitalist government of France. The move sparked a fierce controversy in the international working class movement, as socialists had always rejected accepting such posts. Following debates in 1900 and 1904, the Second International condemned all participation by socialist and capitalist governments. Although, as Ben Lewis and I have discussed, it didn't happen in a straight line, since Kautsky's resolution of 1900 left the door open to opportunist interpretations. But the Second International's 1904 Congress, Kautsky himself helped slam the door shut in an unambiguous resolution. And alongside the condemnation of governmental participation, not giving support to bourgeois parties was seen by left-wing forces in the International as a principled question, in line with Kautsky's assessment of, quote, the bankruptcy of all capitalist parties, something that young people could learn from today, certainly in the United States. Related to the question of Millerandism was Edward Bernstein's attempt to revise Marxism by eliminating its revolutionary essence. Bernstein had been a follower and collaborator of Marx and Engels when they were alive. In the late 1890s, however, Bernstein became increasingly critical of Marxism's political conclusions. His criticisms were codified in his 1899 book, Evolutionary Socialism. In this book, Bernstein openly rejected the revolutionary aims of the socialist movement. The perspective he outlined came to be known as revisionism. Bernstein's challenge found an echo in some sectors of the socialist movement, giving rise to sharp polemics and debates. as many prominent socialists forcefully rejected Bernstein's conclusions and defended Marxism's revolutionary foundations. The same resolution that rejected Millerand's challenge also rejected Bernstein's revisionism and led to a reaffirmation of Marxism within the Second International. Next, the question of war and militarism. There were resolutions on this subject at all Second International Congresses, but with the rise of imperialism around the turn of the century, the terms of the discussion changed. The adopted position of the Second International was that workers needed to oppose all capitalist wars. Not an ounce of support should be extended to these ventures. The old slogan of the German socialist movement, "Not one penny, not one person," to the capitalist war machine, guided the work of most socialists then, just as it remains the stance socialists and communists can look to now. The fight against militarism and war, together with the entire war machine, was seen as a key task, part of the overall working class struggle. The 1907 Congress of the Second International in particular adopted what still stands as the basic position of the Marxist movement in face of imperialist war. A resolution drafted by August Bebel presented some good general points, but in rather abstract terms. But Rosa Luxembourg and V.I. Lenin didn't think it went far enough. The two of them, together with Julius Martav, submitted a series of amendments to sharpen Bebel's resolution, to spell out the need not just for the working class to oppose these wars formally, but to take concrete action against them, and to do so in such a way as to advance the perspective of proletarian revolution. The Luxembourg-Lenin-Martav Amendment was adopted, and the key parts of it were repeated word for word in the resolutions adopted by the Congresses of 1910 and 1912 as well. That's why the Basel Manifesto of 1912 was such a powerful indictment of the betrayers of 1914 and was referred to repeatedly by both Lenin and Luxembourg. Moving on, there were heated debates in the Second International over immigration at the 1904 and 1907 Congresses, as some socialists accepted anti-immigrant arguments that so-called backward, non-white workers could not be organized and took jobs away from native-born workers. As such, they endorsed the concept of restricting immigration. These openly racist arguments were sharply answered by those who supported the traditional socialist view opposing all immigration restrictions, a view that saw immigrants as fellow workers to be welcomed, championed, and organized into the working class struggle. The 1907 Congress rejected the racist anti-immigrant position. There were debates over colonialism. At the Congresses of 1904 and 1907, the question of the new phenomenon of modern colonialism and imperialism was hotly contested. A significant minority at these Congresses supported the perspective of supposed socialist colonialism, in quotes, criticizing colonial abuses, but supporting the idea of colonialism's so-called civilizing mission, and asserting that colonial rule and exploitation would and should still exist under socialism. The pro-colonialist position was ultimately rejected at the 1907 Congress, but only by a surprisingly close vote. There were debates over trade unions. At several Congresses, debates occurred over whether trade unions should be neutral on the question of working class political power. Many conservative-minded trade union officials supported the idea that unions should focus exclusively on narrow, everyday issues such as wages and working conditions, and not take up broad social and political questions. Coming out of these debates, the Second International reaffirmed the traditional Marxist view opposing the so-called neutrality principle and stressing the need for permanent and close contact between trade unions and socialist parties. There were other important discussions and resolutions: labor legislation, public education, the death penalty, democratic rights, cooperatives, international solidarity, political asylum, and so on. Many of these will be of interest to socialists and communists today. Now, just a few words about the book I've edited, which will be published by Haymarket next spring. It's titled Under the Socialist Banner, Resolutions of the Second International, 1889 to 1912. As I referred to earlier, putting this collection together was much more difficult than I originally anticipated. It required going through archival collections, old journals and newspapers, as well as the official Congress proceedings in German and French. French, German, and English were the three official languages of the Second International. The big majority of its resolutions were thus prepared in all three languages. For my book, the English language versions that were prepared or published at the time were utilized where possible. These versions were how the resolutions came to be known among socialists in the English-speaking world. Most resolutions and motions, however, were drafted in either French or German, and some of the original English translations were not particularly readable or accurate. All the resolutions were therefore had to be edited against the French and German versions. But sometimes even this wasn't enough. One example that shows the challenges in putting this book together was the resolution adopted by the 1904 Congress on anti-Semitic pogroms in Tsarist Russia. This resolution was never published in English, nor, as far as I can tell, was it ever published in French or German either. The official Congress proceedings refer to the passage of this resolution, but unlike other resolutions, the text itself wasn't included, nor is the text to be found in any of the Second International's archives. In fact, the resolution appears to have been published only in Yiddish by the Jewish Socialist Bund. So for this book, the document had to be tracked down from the Bund archives in New York. It will thus appear in this book for the first time in English, translated from Yiddish. One other aspect of the book that I think will be useful to readers is the appendix. It will include a number of the unapproved resolutions that can help the readers see more clearly the counterposed positions featured in these debates. Just a word on the nature of these resolutions. When you study the Second International's adopted resolutions and motions in their entirety, their uneven nature is observable. Some resolutions are sharp and clear, others are ambiguous, vague, or even contradictory. A tendency existed toward adopting compromise resolutions in which conflicting views were sometimes papered over. Some of the adopted resolutions were drafted well prior to Congresses, were circulated broadly, and received careful consideration. Other resolutions came about through delegates' motions on the Congress floor that were approved with little or no discussion. Despite this unevenness, however, the resolutions as a whole, with a few exceptions, were guided by the spirit of revolutionary Marxism. Most presented a clear socialist perspective on the major questions facing the working class and the oppressed, many of which remain relevant today. I'll end with what I consider to be valuable about this material today. At the present time, new generations are entering into struggle throughout the world as the recent upsurge around Black Lives Matter and police brutality demonstrates. By entering the struggle, these young people and others are giving themselves the opportunity to link up with the history and traditions of the revolutionary movement around the world. In the United States, at least, this intensification of the struggle is combined with a growing interest in socialism. The recent tenfold growth of the Democratic Socialists of America is an indication of this. Many of these thousands of young people are revolutionary minded and are attracted to terms like revolution, class struggle, and openly identify with Marx and Engels. Despite this sentiment, however, relatively few really know much about socialism's history, nor are most of them fully aware of the movement's revolutionary thrust. For this reason, many, if not most, get pulled into various reformist schemes. But through studying the Second International during its Marxist period, it's possible to learn about the revolutionary nature of the socialist movement, to learn about its position on bourgeois parties and capitalist governments, to see clearly that only through the revolutionary transformation of society and its property relations will it be possible to eliminate the evils they see around them. So for young people like this, studying the resolutions of the Second International during this period can be a bridge, so to speak, to revolutionary Marxism. That's what I hope in any case. My aim in preparing a book of Second International resolutions is not to attempt to recreate the Second International with all of its weaknesses and contradictions. I see the resolutions of the Second International of 1889 to 1912 not as a step backward, but on the contrary, as a way forward, as a point of entry into the tradition of revolutionary Marxism, to enable new generations of radicalizing young people to link up with Marx, Engels, Lenin, Trotsky, Luxembourg, Zetkin, and the early Communist International, to link up with the revolutionary tradition of revolutionary action of the communists, of the Paris Commune, the Russian Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, and countless other struggles by the working class on the road to its emancipation. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Can the host please unmute me? Here we are. Hello. Yeah, thanks for that, Mike. I was muted for a moment. We'll go on to discussion now. And people can indicate by putting their, I think they can put a little blue hand up. If you click the, yes, if you click on participants, then you can see a menu, invite, mute me, raise hand. So you raise your hand if you want to speak there. You can also indicate in the chat column. If I'm clever, I'll be able to see it. So who would like to speak first? Is anybody ready? Mike's saying applause, that's good. Can you hear the applause? Okay. Yeah, so I can't see anybody saying yet that they want to speak. All dumbfounded. Okay. Who's first in? Is that Sashin? Sashin saying yes. Okay. Sashin. Are you wanting to speak, Sashin? You're muted. You're still muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's just, I thought I'd just say something just to get things going. Yeah, okay, couple of things. I'll probably go backwards. It was just to get things going. The consensus that I've come across is that, like, with the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, the Bolsheviks formalized themselves somehow as a party in 1912, so right at the end of the period that you're talking about there. How was that reflected in the Second International, or was all the way through, say, 1914 and onwards, it's still seen as the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party? Yeah. A second thing was, I'll probably come back because it was just because nobody was saying anything. I'll shut up now. Thank you.
Yeah, the same thing. Host got me muted. Is that right? Martin Beveridge wants to speak. Is that correct? So I'm told, Martin, and then Ken Syme. Martin? Is Martin Beveridge here? Yes?
All right, I think I'm unmuted now.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'd like to congratulate Mike on a very interesting talk and the incredibly detailed work he's had to do to put together his new book. I just got one comment really, is that in studying these resolutions of the Second International, as with the Third and so on and so forth, it's, I think, only half the job, insofar as I think they've got to be put in their social and economic context. In particular, this period of 1890 to 1912, you saw a big expansion of mass working class parties, which made everybody to think that they formed a huge force, but these parties were very much formed within a national context. And so the discrepancies between the resolutions and in society really came sharply to a focus in 1914 with the onset of the First World War, which of course took place by virtue of processes which were outside and independent of the discussions and rhetoric of the Second International. So I think that Mike's work is really only a starting point, and if it's to be made relevant to today, then that work of researching the social and economic conditions of the various parties that made up the Second International still has to be done. Okay. That's it, I've stopped.
Ken, go ahead. Ken Syme.
I think he began by...
Yeah, I can hear you.
Can you hear me? Yes? Yeah. Michael began by saying that, you know, two of the main subjects were anarchism and the general strike. He then said that 1893, 1896, anarchists effectively were sort of barred from the Second International. Was there much attempt by the anarchists to get themselves back in? And I wonder myself how far, if they had still been there, whether the 1914 episode might have been avoided. But that's one of the great what-ifs of history, I'm sure. So I would be interested in his views on that. Thank you.
Mike McNair, please. And then Anne. Mike McNair.
Okay, this is just, I guess, more. I thank you, Mike, for this a really interesting talk. We've published now twice. Ben did a translation of the resolution on immigration in the Weekly Worker as a way of intervening in today's left-wing debates about migration, and it's just illustrative of how useful some of this stuff is. I think, I guess I would address it in relation to both Martin's and Ken's points, and to some extent, actually, how should I put this? There's an issue about that. On the one hand, they had a conception that they needed an international. But on the other hand, very strongly, they had a conception of national roads, that it was going to be national roads to socialism and socialism in a single country. That's there in Kautsky's The Class Struggle, his description, his introduction to the Erfurt program. And it's also very strongly there in his work on nationalism, which Ben translated for critique in the debate on the national question. It seems that there's actually quite a minority point of view which actually understands or grasps the dynamic, the extent to which the world politics was a dynamic as global politics. And actually quite a lot of the people who did understand it, which is Parvus and those guys, went over and became German nationalists in 1914 because they understood rightly that Britain was ruling the world before 1914 in the way in which the United States rules the world now. And then they had this delusion that the way out of that situation was for the workers' movement to hitch its wagon to the Kaiserreich. But the sense of, it seems to me that there's quite a lot of stuff where they are actually certainly very visible in the discussions of imperialism and in the discussions of permanent revolution, which we've seen had the Comrades Day and Guido have produced editions of, that they are actually discussing in the international and in the German SPD world politics, global politics, imperialism, colonialism, and war, and so on. It's not the case, contrary to the Cold War narratives of it, that they didn't think about this stuff, that they were purely European and European-centric, and that was what it was. But they were actually talking about this stuff, but they were doing so within the framework that somehow the idea of international action didn't find a reflection in the conception of what their parties were for. That is my impression, and I don't know whether Mike can contradict or improve on that issue. From that point of view, I don't see any reason to suppose that the anarchists being still present in the international would have made the least difference in 1914, because what's the dynamic around 1914 is around geopolitics. That's it.
Again, yeah, okay, thanks, Mike. And we've got Anne and then Alan, as in the chat column. Anne, please.
Okay, yeah, all right, thanks, Mike. It was a very fascinating presentation. And I think that this whole history will be of enormous assistance to us, particularly as it mirrors so many of the dilemmas and tasks facing the left at the present time. What I really wanted to ask is about the attitude of the Third International, I suppose, are the Bolsheviks, or the Bolsheviks will say, to the Second International, and also leading supporters of the Bolshevik like Clara Zetkin. Because from my own research into Kommunistka, the women's, the journal of the women's section, it seems that the rejection of the Second International reads like it's a rejection of everything that was a problem, and and also that the fragments of the Second International that existed in the workers' movement were a real opponent, a difficulty in making progress. And it seems to me at times that the rejection of the Second International includes a rejection of their own history. For instance, like Zetkin and Kollontai and obviously others, Armand and others were involved in the Second International women's section. And yet they outright reject it. Now, I can see the point you're making insofar as they're saying that it wasn't doing what it said formally. You know, it said the words, but it actually wasn't actually doing anything about its political aims. But nevertheless, it seems that in a way that they're rejecting, to me, it often feels as though they're rejecting their own history, and that perhaps, that's a large part of the reason why that history disappeared, because it seems that, there was a need, obviously, given the war and the treachery of the Second International in voting for war credits. There was a need to distance themselves from that, but I don't get myself that there was an attempt to say good Second International, bad Second International. Now, obviously, their perspective on it was very different given the period that they were living through and the battles that faced them. So that kind of brings me to my second point. My question really is that, to what extent did it present? Obviously in Britain, you can see the Labour Party was a big problem and it's part of the Second International, but outside of that, to what extent did it really present an ongoing problem as an opponent to the Third International making progress? So that basically they're my points. Thank you.
I'll have to ask the host not to keep muting me, because I can't chair if I can't speak, okay? I'll mute myself. Thank you. Alan, go ahead.
Yeah, I just have a question about the calling the Second International revolutionary, or considering that it had a revolutionary period and by implication a non-revolutionary period. That's a bit unclear to me. You didn't make that clear in the presentation when you thought that transformation occurred and how that occurred. Certainly for me, the Second International prior to World War I was an organisation that contained revolutionaries. But the problem of, as you outlined in the presentation, not being an organisation which acted on the words of its resolutions makes that revolutionary content of those words, when that occur, somewhat a moot point, surely. I mean, how would you understand the critique of the Second International and the explanation for its betrayal at the beginning of the First World War, which was outlined by Lenin and the Bolsheviks post that betrayal? That an organisation of the form of the Second International could not be revolutionary by its very nature of attempting to gather together all the activists of the working class across the revolutionary to reform spectrum. And it was, as Lenin and the Bolsheviks understood, necessary to gather the revolutionaries together, and that would be the way that you could have a revolutionary organisation, hence the Third International and Communist parties. Finish.
Please don't mute me, host. Thank you. I'm chairing, okay? Don't mute me. Ben, go ahead.
Hello, comments. Can you hear me? I'm very good. Okay. First of all, thank you to Mike for the presentation and your hard work on all this. I'm looking forward to seeing the book in its entirety. I suppose there's a lot to cover, but I wanted to, I think, focus mainly on two things and maybe briefly just come back to what Alan said just then. The first point is on your the issue of relevance and the youth. And clearly I'm not somebody who's a youth anymore. I was once, I suppose we all were. But the idea of young people coming into politics, into left-wing politics, and learning the need to learn about our own revolutionary past, I would go beyond that to a certain extent. Is that the significance of this work for me partly is based not just on educating the youth, it's also avoiding as much as possible the miseducation of the youth, if you like, by when they come into contact with the far left, given the misrepresentations, the lies, the falsifications that have been spread about Second International Marxism, so-called, the history of the Second International, which, as you rightly point out, if we see this as this movement as kind of innately flawed or inherently flawed, that means, in a sense, actually taking on, calling into question the revolutionary credentials of people as far-fled as starting from Engels through to Lenin, Luxembourg, etc. I thought that was a very good point with which you started it. So I think there's a deeper significance, rather than just educating the young and those coming into struggle for the first time, but actually challenging many of the kind of sacred beliefs on the far left when it comes to the history of the Second International, which partly, it must be said, are based on or flow from or reinforced by the absence of this kind of primary source material on what the International was doing, what it was deciding, what it was discussing, etc., etc. So I think there's another level of significance to what you're saying, and I suppose this flows onto Anne's point about, well, what did the Bolsheviks say about the Second International? And of course, this kind of flows from the meeting we had, I think, was it 2 weeks ago, with David Brandenburger on the history of the official party history of the Bolsheviks as penned by Stalin and edited by him, a draft put to him by party historians, which he then heavily edited. It relates to that because it seems to me that, like all of these things, if you want to talk about what the leading Bolsheviks said about the Second International, I suppose the first couple of questions you'd have to ask is, well, who and at what point? Because it seems to me that the self-understanding of Bolshevism is something, as we all know, mutates over time. There's the 1920s discussions, and then certainly by Stalin's short course, as we've seen in Brandenburger's presentation, the whole party history is being rewritten already upon being rewritten. So it's kind of peeling the onion further and further apart. So I think there is a tendency, if you read, the short course of Stalin, I've written about this in my work on Kautsky. Stalin, in the way he approaches it in the late 1930s, is to say, well, look, Bolshevism and social democracy, European social democracy, the Second International, are completely worlds apart. They had nothing to do with each other. We were a unique movement, a party of a new type, blah, 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 blah. And that's kind of projected backwards onto it. That's in a sense, that's one of the key sources of the discrediting of the Second International and its ideas and its people and its resolutions, etc. So there's that. But I think you can also trace it back then and say, well, that is clearly a rewriting of Bolshevik understanding of the Second International. There's phrases that Lenin and Zinoviev use literally when they're writing in Switzerland in 1914. They talk about revolutionary social democracy, the Marxist trends of the Second International. That was what Bolshevism understood itself to be a part of, and that's what it then sought to build and to build upon in terms of the coming struggles that it faced in actually reforging a communist alternative, a Marxist alternative. That was the basis on which they proceeded, right? So they're looking at this whole thing collapsing around them, and they're looking at people like Kautsky and criticizing them in the strictest, the fiercest of terms, because these people are the ones who have precisely turned their backs on the resolutions, the ideas, many of the founding things that trend stood for. So I think that's a key part of the kind of background or the meta history here to why to put it in short terms, the Second International has such a bad rap in Marxist circles is the fact that the true understanding has been lost and falsified subsequently. There's also an interesting point on 1912 in this regard, by the way, in the so-called foundation of Bolshevism in 1912. If you look at Brandenburger's book, there's lots of evidences have been pointed out by a comrade of mine, Linden, who's gone through the book. And Stalin, instead of referring to the Menshevik liquidators, gets rid of all that and says, we got rid of the Mensheviks in 1912, right? That was the big thing. So that's clearly, this kind of meta-narrative also influences our understanding of the Second International through to this day. And the more we can understand about it, the better. Just a final quick point, just bouncing off Alan in that sense. Alan talks about gathering the revolutionaries together in the face of this, apocalypse of the revolutionary forces of the Second International collapsing pitifully in front of imperialism, despite all the things that it said. But again, we need to look at where do the revolutionaries that they're gathering together come from? Right, they are precisely the opposition that they begin to organize, not just in Russia but in Germany, etc. They are actually members of the Second International to all intents and purposes, and these people who are schooled in that, who had their education in that, to a large extent, then become the leaders of German communism, of Russian Bolshevism, etc., etc. So we have to be careful in that sense, not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. In that sense, there was a revolutionary social democratic trend it was actually the leading trend within it. There's all sorts of problems and issues with that looking back, and I think Mike's point, Mike Tabor's point on using these resolutions as a point of entry, not a kind of rehabilitation or resuscitation of the Second International, is absolutely correct. But these were the forces the forces that made the Russian Revolution, the forces that then reforged what became the Third International. To a large extent, they were forged in, and they cut their political teeth, as it were, within the Second International itself, and that should not be forgotten. I will end there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. And I've got, is it Gabby or Phil? Gabriella.
Gabby.
You're speaking. Okay, go ahead, and then we come back to Jack after that.
It's basically a question. In the distant why am I hearing? I'm hearing some feedback sound. In the dim and distant past, I remember hearing about the 2.5 International, and I don't remember anything else about it except that it existed. So I wondered if there were any links between the two and the 2.5 and the 2.5 and the 3, or if it was simply a blip in the ocean somewhere. That's it. Just a question.
Jack Conrad.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Very interesting. Looking forward to the book. Sort of taking up on what Ben was saying. Maybe you've got a dream, Mike, of your book, circulating around lots of eager young activists. I do suspect somehow some of them will have more, in terms of your average reader, will be more of the grey-haired variety. Why? I think because actually our role, while we've got life left in us, is to act as teachers. And the problem is that over the last, not 1 or 2 or 3 decades, but over a whole historical period, much of the real history of the Third International has been lost. And you and John have done a fantastic job recovering that history. But the history, again, as you were saying earlier, the history of the Second International has almost been totally obscured. And so in terms of our movement, it really has been lobotomized. It's been lobotomized on the right by the Labourites, by the Social Democrats, who are now indistinguishable from capitalist parties. But also on the left, there's been a tragic forgetting. Whole areas of history are simply not known or not treated seriously. And I would include the history of the Bolshevik Party in that, and then, of course, the wider Second International. So I think it's very much about teaching the teachers. That's how I would approach your book. Just in terms of the anarchists, let's just remind ourselves of perhaps the most famous living anarchist in Russia in 1914, Prince Kropotkin. What was his position on the war? He was in favor of the war. So we shouldn't have this idea of the anarchists somehow being immune from such, a social chauvinist, social patriotic infection. They can go down with it as well. So in terms of the anarchists, they were one, very weak, but they were not a bastion of principle. So I just think that we need to be clear on that one. In terms of what both Gabby and Anne raised, Mike actually did refer to it, and I think that's a very interesting angle in terms of the Third International's dismissal of the Second International. Why? Because it was a living rival for them. It wasn't something that they weren't dealing with history. They were dealing with the other bloke or other woman in the trade union meeting. They were dealing with people on the same demonstration, on the same strike, in the same parliament. And, I think we need to remember that while often in some European countries, the communists won a majority of the activists, so that was the case, I think, in Italy and France, Germany. I don't know, Ben, in terms of the independents, but clearly you did win a majority at the Halle Congress. But the fact of the matter was, this is why you had the United Front tactic, the majority of working class voters at that time remained loyal to either the parties of the Second International or official social democracy, labourism, call it what you will, or of the 2.5 International. What was it? The Amsterdam International. So these movements were real. That's the point that I would emphasize, which is what Mike was actually saying. So this wasn't about history. This was about living politics. And in living politics, you are sometimes forced to adopt a much more crude, much more blunt approach than you would if you were sitting in your study, 100 years removed from a question. Just in terms of Alan, that the Second International wasn't revolutionary, but it contained revolutionaries. I think that's profoundly wrong, because what you were dealing with, apart from Russia in 1905, is a non-revolutionary situation. And I ask you, Alan, you're in Ireland, I might say, where's your gun? Maybe it was an unfortunate choice of country. But the point I would be making is that your main role as a revolutionary in Ireland, just like my main role as a revolutionary in Britain, is publishing revolutionary propaganda and revolutionary agitation. Go on strike, yeah, but don't go to the barricades with your gun. This is the history of our movement. These are our tasks. That's our role at the present time. And if you look back at the Second International, what was it meant to do? Set up the barricades? Well, no. Actually, if you want to look at the Marxist movement under Marx, what was particularly noticeable about it is Marx's role in actually urging his followers, how should we put it, revolutionary patience, hold back, don't go for it until we're ready, wait for others, look at the international situation, a definite long-term vision. And all I would say that in a non-revolutionary situation, you have to judge organizations by what they say. That's what they do. And if a body like the Second International passes a series of resolutions which are good on war and peace, on colonialism, on immigration, and one carries on down the list that Mike has given us, if they pass resolutions like that, that actually characterizes their politics. Hence, we get into the reaction of Lenin and his comrades and others around the world, like Luxembourg and Leibniz, when they attack Kautsky and when they attack the majority for being renegades, for being traitors. Well, you can't be a renegade if you're a reformist. You can't betray revolution unless you are a revolutionary. So I think that the title of Lenin's book, The Renegade Kautsky, needs to be taken seriously. Kautsky was a revolutionary who betrayed himself and betrayed his tradition. And I think we need to understand that. That's all.
Okay, I've got Kevin. I hope you're all right with this, Mike. Got Kevin to speak, ask a question rather, and perhaps it'll be Mike Tabor then for a bit. Kevin, go ahead, please.
Okay, thanks, Mike. That was a very, very interesting talk and thought-provoking. I've been doing some reading at the moment on John Riddell's of the Third International conferences, and I've also come across some of your material as well. And one of the questions that comes up particularly in the second and third congresses is, I suppose, of the Third International, is the relationship of what we might think of as the international and the international leadership with the constituent parties, and the relationship between centralization and national sections, and particularly around the debates in Italy and Germany and France. But what that made me think about in relation to your talk was really how far the Second International functioned in the constituent parties and groupings as an effective international. I'm particularly, we know about the German SPD, we know about its culture, its politics, and indeed its the range of material that it produced, and its very lively living political culture. But I wondered if we can see any relationship between the positions taken, say, at the congresses and debates which are going on inside the national parties. And, I am familiar with some of the primary material of British socialist groups before the First World War, and I can see echoes and I can see references. But what I don't always see in groups like the SDF is that their debate is really framed in relation to the international. So that there does seem to me to be a clear difference between the second and the third in that way. But I just wondered if you were aware of whether there was, in a sense, a living connection between the party activists and the international in terms of specific debates, or whether it was perhaps more perfunctory. But I'd be interested to hear what you have on that. Thank you.
Well, Mike, there's no one showing at the moment, unless I'm mistaken. But people can come back again if they want. But would you like to talk now for a while? Can't hear you yet. There we are. Go ahead, Mike. You're muted again.
Can you hear me now? Okay. Okay, just on some of the points on Sachin's question about the Bolsheviks, or the RSDLP towards the Second International. Lenin was a member of the Second International's, the International Socialist Bureau, for a number of years, and they were all, the Bolsheviks had representatives on, on the body from really all the way up to from 1904 all the way up to the outbreak of the First World War, and they viewed themselves as a member party. This is what they identified with it. But at the same time, as the debate within the Second International developed, they began to use the to try to coalesce the left-wing elements within the Second International. You see that, Lenin's collaboration with Rosa Luxembourg in 1907. At the Congress in 1910, Lenin organized a meeting of left-wing delegates who were there, which included a number of key figures who came to it, which is not, it's not general, it's not, people don't really talk about that, but it didn't really go anywhere at that time, but it sort of laid the basis for subsequent efforts during the First World War, the Zimmerwald movement, and so forth. As to the question of that Ken raised about the anarchists, and which Jack came back to. One of the points is the split that took place in the world workers movement in 1914 went across every conceivable current, including the anarcho-syndicalist movement, which split, between the best example was in France, where the CGT, the majority leadership of the CGT went in with the Sacred Union, and the left wing that began to develop in opposition to that took place. But you saw the same types of divisions as you saw within the socialist movement. The question that Gabby raised on, about the 2.5 international, which, Anne sort of came at it in a different way, is important. And this relates to the point that Jack made about that also. At the time, the 2.5 international, which the Comintern was dealing with it, from 1921 on, really. These were people who called themselves revolutionary Marxists, said that they supported the dictatorship of the proletariat, called for socialist revolution, and they were putting themselves forward as an alternative to the Comintern. Of course, they eventually just refused with the Second International, became part of that. But this is what they were, this is what the the pressure that this placed on the workers' movement, at the time, that were coming to communism, as well as with forces within the communist movement that were sort of attracted to that trajectory. This is what, one of the things that they were dealing with. It's important. It's just important to keep that in mind in terms of how the question of the Second International is framed in a lot of debates that you see in 1920, 21, 22, and so forth. Let's see. Yeah, I think so, some of the points that Anne made, Anne and I have been in touch with the other with her, her project on the communist women's movement in Russia, and the book that we're preparing now in the communist movement, women's movement internationally. And here the question of the Second International's, I think it's actually very helpful in understanding, what. This whole point about what the real legacy of the Second International was, that the Second International adopted some very good resolutions on women's emancipation. But it really did, and most Second International parties actually did very little about it. And it was women within the Second International, like Clara Zetkin, Kollontai, and others, who created the International Socialist Women's Movement, that fought within their parties to turn them to this issue, which they were really not all that successful. It wasn't until the communist movement that some of these things began to see them bearing fruit. But it really does help illustrate, the importance of of the resolutions, and because this is where the Third International came from. This is where all the different elements within the Third International came from. On Kevin's question on the really, I guess it's sort of the relationship between the national and the international debates. Again, here as the polarization, political polarization within the Second International occurred throughout the early years of the 20th century, and in particular, this was reflected as well. The fact of the closeness of the votes on some of these questions tells you a lot. The fact that the socialist colonialism position was close to winning a majority. They actually did get a majority in the commission that prepared the resolution, but then it was rejected by the Congress itself and in a narrow vote. As well as some of the other things that were listed. This tells you a lot of what's going on, and in the same way as Ben would know this very well. On how the German Social Democratic Party condemned Bernstein by like a 90% vote, but that doesn't tell you the reality of what was taking place in the German Social Democratic Party and the amount of support that Bernstein had within the leadership. People who didn't want to admit it, and they figured, okay, you don't say it, you just do it. So that was all these questions of. I think it gets, Jack's point on the importance of really looking at this history, and why it's so important to new generations, and not just, I'm just talking about the youth, but others and the generations to come. People, of my age and or older or younger. A little bit younger. These things have an importance for all of us, and I think that Ben's point about of the importance of not letting history be rewritten and not losing the real lessons is absolutely essential, and it's one of the things that those of us who have some experience in the movement can help impart some of these lessons to others as we ourselves participate in these things. I'll stop for now.
Yes, we have got more speakers. Yeah, we have to remember the history. I remember how much the media here went to town on the anniversary of World War I. And if you're not interested in it, if we're not interested in it, then the ruling class is definitely going to write it their own way. And I still remember Arthur Scargill's famous saying, I'm not interested in what two dead Russians had to say to each other 100 years ago. Something like that. Total Philistine attitude. Of course, it leaves it to the ruling class to take care of our history for us, which is not what we want. I got Jack Conrad to speak.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I just wanted to come back or develop or actually ask some questions as well. One of the great photographs of the Second International, I think, was the Amsterdam Congress at the Diamond Cutters headquarters, from my memory. And you've got pictures of tables with the delegates and their national sections all sitting there, presumably with translators or whatever, I'm not quite sure. But what I wanted to raise with you is, I presume that there was some sort of delegate ratio. So I know that at the, I think, Amsterdam Congress, the Socialist Party of Great Britain was represented. I I presume the SDF, Social Democratic Federation, or might have been called Social Democratic Party in Britain, was represented. But clearly, once the Labour Party successfully affiliated, I presume that that would have swamped the British delegation. And okay, national delegations didn't vote as a bloc, but clearly the Labour Party, with Lenin's approval, would have been both a huge gain for the international, because the British working class was huge, but also because it was reformist, maybe is maybe the wrong word, because a lot of them wouldn't even be committed to socialism until 1918 formally. Anyway, my main point is I wanted to ask you, Mike, really about how the strength of delegations was determined. And to me, that would at least be in part an explanation of why, when it came to the colonial question, the vote was so narrow, because you can guarantee, or at least I can guarantee, how the Labour Party delegation would have voted, given that Britain ruled the world's largest empire. So that's one question. In terms of, I just wanted to also add, because one of the first contributions, I can't remember who it is from, comrade, so you have to forgive me not knowing your name, but was sort of talking about the Socialist International, the Second International, as sort of something outside society. And I would just emphasize the point that if you read a lot of bourgeois history, in terms of Germany and Britain in particular, one of the reasons why the ruling classes wanted to go to war was the material threat of the working class movement domestically. I think that was true in Germany, and that was certainly true in Britain in terms of the strike movement and the militancy of the working class. So in terms of clamping down at home, one way is to have a foreign diversion. I'm not saying that World War I was purely about that. That would be silly. There were international rivalries. Britain wanted to put down Germany. Nevertheless, the strength of the working class movement and its militancy clearly counted. And yeah, the last point I would make is really about the Bernstein thing. I mean, isn't it interesting that, you know, if we take these so-called neat divisions that we might have in our minds, that anarchists do this and Bolsheviks do that. Well, the Bolsheviks actually did act in an incredibly disciplined and united way. But the point I wanted to make is about the arch revisionist. Where did he end up? He ended up with Kautsky in a centrist position. He didn't end up as an extreme advocate of the Kaiser state and its war. So I just think that if we take these questions, we need to be careful. And as Mike McNair pointed out, when it came to 1914, we in the Weekly Worker, with Ben's help, with Mike's help, with comrades translating it from Turkish, we actually researched into the far left of the Second International and looked at how they responded to World War I. And as Mike McNair pointed out, they didn't necessarily end up on the side that you might have thought that they ended up on. A lot of them were advocates of imperialist war because they thought that would have a progressive outcome. Parvus is one, but there were many others besides Parvus.
Yeah, Sachin has got a few words, and then Ben again. Sachin, please.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So this is both to the main speaker, but also for other things that I've listened to. So for the first speaker, one of the things that you talk about was unevenness, and And I think one of the reasons you were talking about unevenness, which you probably said quite succinctly, was that there was probably a lot of people in the world not didn't have delegations themselves, and of course you didn't know the whole world. So in terms of unevenness, then to what extent then did they consider themselves in that time to be transitional, as opposed to considering themselves like there's some so-called internationals these days that, you know, it's like they were to go to what's to be done, to phrase something from that, seem like they were born fully armed and fully clothed and will be able to tell everybody exactly what, you know, what to do. This is what you need to do right now. So to what extent there did they consider themselves to be transitional, to accept at least, you know, and the other side of it may have been also when you've got a conference, you don't necessarily have all the time in the world to be able to give materials out, especially to people coming from all across the world during, you know, pre times like this. The question to Ben is, he mentioned something about miseducation, but I personally wouldn't use that phrase, like, but tell me if you think otherwise, because surely like people use history in their own way. You know, a phrase is not to throw the baby out with the bathwater in our culture, but of course, you know, like, but that helps us in a way, because people do then try to forget, they try to fudge, they try to cover things over, whereas, you know, where, like the main speaker mentioned translating for the first time, probably from the Polish or somewhere, like of documents that were never actually translated. Gabriella, my sort of take on it was initially because of what happened in 14 breakage, and then Kautsky actually ended up in the 2.5, and then remerging with the 2 to what we have today, and didn't joining with the 3. Okay. There's a few more things, but it looks like time is becoming more sacred. But like, I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Yeah, self-censorship, eh? It's terrible. I've got Jim. No, wait a minute. Ben. Yeah, Ben now, and then Jim. Okay, Ben.
Look, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'll have to be quick. I'm afraid I'm going to miss your summing up, Mike. I've got bedtime to sort out. Not my own, I hasten to add, but I will have to dash off. So I just wanted to come back on a few things. Alan has written a few things in the chat, I think, in response to me immediately. So I'll just kind of dig them up. I know he's going to come in a second, so it can carry on without me subsequently. But I think the basic point he was making is that, you know, okay, so you're right, there were revolutionaries in the Second International, which by implication means that it wasn't revolutionary organization. But the lesson that the Bolsheviks then draw is that one should build an organization which contains revolutionaries and not people of all strands and tendencies. A party of the whole class can be used, maybe not, but that's the conclusion they draw. All I would say, and this relates to one thing, Mike, you actually missed out at the start, which I think could be important for the article, is that when it came to the founding of the Second International, right, it was done on very specific grounds. And partly one of the key drivers behind that, as Mike explained, was Friedrich Engels, right? they've seen the need now that the German party was growing, France was growing incredibly, things are starting to move. They said, okay, what do we do this time around that didn't happen before in the first international? Mike alluded, and we've discussed about the anarchists. The anarchists were effectively booted out relatively quickly, right? When it comes to the reformists, or the possibilists, as they were known in France, when it comes to 1889, on the same day, in the same city, there are two founding congresses of the Second International. So maybe that could be the 2 1/4 International. You know, it doesn't last very long at all, because the main one, the big congress, the one that's important, that's successful, is the Marxist one, right? So it's not that then, you know, so we can't see the Second International as an organization that is built by people like Engels and the German leadership, etc., and Jaurès Guesde in France. We can't see it as a kind of loose party of the whole class, everyone's welcome type organization, which then only in 1914, Lenin and Zinoviev think, oh Christ, maybe we should do this a bit differently. The way it was set up was done in a conscious way, and I think that's being lost here in that discussion. And that was precisely the basis of the Marxist International should be working class parties with certain programs, with certain structures. Engels fought a lot of battles around that and put that precise founding thing. And precisely for that reason, the possibilists, as they were known at the time, people like Bruce and others in France, they set up their own counter founding international, which doesn't go anywhere and is quickly overtaken. But that was the conscious mindset behind it, and I think that shouldn't be forgotten, because it sets up a false dichotomy between the Third International, if you like, and the Second International, which in my opinion doesn't exist. So I think that would be worth, maybe including the article, just the two congresses at the start. And just quickly on miseducation is a term you can use anything. I mean, Mike came in with some distortion. My point is simply that when we look back at our history, given the defeats of our movement over the years and what is all the things that have happened, we cannot talk of continuity. We cannot talk of just a straight line of inherited knowledge, etc. There's conflicts. These things are contested, as all history is. But there are clear, and with increasing documented material, clear evidence of sheer and utter distortion of our own history. And I think the problem, this is my point at the start, the problem with the far left's general collective understanding of the Second International is that it's rooted in a lot of these distortions still to this day. And I think that's the significance of people like Mike and their work and others. And thank you again, Mike. I look forward to reading the article and reading the book and probably maybe reviewing it. And I will have to head out there. Comments. I will watch the rest though, so on catch up. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Okay, I've got Jim Cook and then Alan again.
Hello.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was motivated to speak by Stan's comment actually about World War I and about how that's been played up so much. And of course, we've had the 75th anniversary of whatever it was recently. We've had the bloke pushing in Zimmer frame around the yard. They work overtime, of course, to decide on what history is and what reality is. And I'm sure everybody here will have had the experience of if they mention to somebody that they happen to be a communist, then they can get a deluge of stuff from all sorts of people who don't know what they're talking about. And of course, we've had the barrage over anti-Semitism over the last few years of this attempt to make sure that any history is in the terms that are decided upon by the ruling class. And of course, Black Lives Matter, they want to take that on, to take on the history of colonialism and so on and so on and so on. But these waves come along, and when we have to fight our end. And what Jack was talking about, in education, the thing is, if we have these arguments with people who don't know what communism is, who think all sorts of things about history and so on, then preferably we need to have some background ourselves. We need to be able to back up our side of the argument and be able to say what really happened, and not just be forced into a corner of ignorance. That's it.
Okay, thanks, Jim. It's Alan, please. Alan Gibson.
just a quick point on lessons. Certainly it's important to understand the Second International and the important role that it played in the workers' movement, and how there was a pre-World War I consensus on the nature of organisation required to overthrow capitalism and usher in socialism. That was agreed by all the socialists, by all the Marxists. And I can accept Ben's point about the impulse in setting up the Second International, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the organisation which became the mass party of the working class in the period leading up to World War I, particularly in Germany. And so, unlike Ben's assertion, I think that what happened at the outbreak of World War I does show a clear dichotomy between the Second International and the Third International, which only comes into existence because of the lessons that are learnt by the betrayal of the Second International. I mean, to say that there is no dichotomy between the politics of the Third and the Second International is to disappear the betrayal of August 1914. And thinking about lessons, what are the lessons that should be learnt other than historical lessons about the development of the workers' movement and revolutionary politics? But what are the concrete lessons that should be learnt by young want-to-be revolutionaries today? Because it's not that the ideas of a Second International as per the one that existed prior to the formation of the Third International don't exist at all. They do exist, and in fact they probably are the dominant ideas within the wider socialist movement in a broad sense of what kind of party you need. So I think that the lesson of the betrayal of August 1914 and the necessity for an organisation in the broad sense of the Third International, one that gathers together revolutionaries, and within that there's still plenty of scope and for political difference and plenty of scope for a spectrum of opinions, but that the line between reform and revolution, which was exposed by that betrayal, is the important lesson that should be taken from that, which is not to say that it's not important, as I said, to understand the Second International and its place in history, but in terms of what we should be trying to build as revolutionaries now, I think the aim is the Third International, not the Second International that betrayed. Finish.
Thanks, Alan. Okay, we've got Jack again, Jack Conrad.
Yeah, I won't overindulge myself, I promise. I was just going to point out, in terms of what Alan was saying, that no one's disputing, how should I put it, the break of 1914. So obviously, if you're talking about the renegade Kautsky, and you're talking about 1914, Kautsky betrayed. German social democracy betrayed. It betrayed the resolutions it had voted for. So no one's talking about it being, well, the Second International became the Third International. The point would be that the Third International drew on and consisted of people who'd been in the Second International and had played a leading role in the Second International. Mike has already referred to Lenin. Lenin was on the International Socialist Bureau. He represented Russia. He represented the Bolsheviks on that leading committee. Was there a continuity between the Bolsheviks in 1914 and 1917? Well, of course there was. So what we're talking about is some people who adhered to the healthy resolutions that Mike has referred to and viewed those resolutions seriously, right? And were prepared to die for those resolutions, right? Lenin constantly, throughout the period of 1914 onwards, kept quoting the Baal Manifesto Manifesto, kept quoting the resolutions of the Second International, committing itself to use the opportunity of war to make revolution. That is something he adhered to, and he beat the renegades over their heads, over their own heads, with what they had voted for. So I think we need to understand that one. In terms of what type of party are we after? We're after a revolutionary party. The real problem that we've got is there is not a consensus, I think, on the left at the present time of what we mean. Do we want a party? A lot of the left say, no, we need a movement. What sort of a party? A broad party, often people say, that covers both reformists and revolutionaries. And then when people do talk about a revolutionary party, often what they actually mean is a revolutionary sect that has to believe in X, Y, and Z shibboleths, right? So I don't think that there's a consensus, Alan, in terms of what needs to be done. And I think that's the value of studying history. It's not that we want to repeat it, but there's valuable material there to learn from. How did we come to where we are? Just lastly, in respect to what Sachin was saying, well, you know, I come, you know, in terms of my extreme youth, I come from the official communist position. To say that I wasn't miseducated, well, it just takes my breath away. Of course I was miseducated, you know, so the idea that the Labour Party doesn't miseducate us, well, I think that again surely goes without saying. Yes, they do. They miseducate us constantly. The nature of 1945, the nature of World War II, one can just carry on down the list. We're all in it together. That is miseducation. And what I would argue is that as well as official communism and official social democracy doing that, we on the revolutionary left have also forgotten a lot about our own history. And I think that's the value of the sort of work that Mike has been doing, and Ben and Lars T. Lee and other communists. You don't need to agree with everything they're saying, but here's material about the history of our movement that we need to learn, not just because we want to rebuff the bourgeoisie, but because we actually want to build a movement that can do the job that the Second International failed to do, and the Third International failed to do, or if you want, and the Fourth International failed to do. And that isn't to condemn anybody and say that history is rubbish because they failed, but unless we learn from the past, then I think that we're doomed to make maybe not the same mistake, but the same mistake again, but on a lower and more pathetic level.
I think Chris Gray wants to speak, or was he saying goodbye? He was waving. Has he gone? Are you there, Chris? No, I saw him waving his hands. Must have been a goodbye. Okay. Just giving him a moment. No, he's not there. Okay, Mike, do you want to talk some more? Respond to some of that? Okay. You're muted. You're muted.
Okay.
There you are.
Well, just a couple of things. One on the question related to the British Labour Party and its representation within the Second International Congresses. I could be misremembering from looking at the delegate list, but I don't think that the Labour Party itself was actually represented at the Congresses. There were, you know, big delegations from the ILP, from the SDF. There were, you know, representatives from the Fabian Society and, you know, other organizations, and, you know, and of course, you know, the trade unions themselves. But I don't think during this the period from when the Labour Party was admitted, it might have been, I don't remember for sure whether it might have been 1908.
1908 for sure.
Yeah, 1908 until in other words, for the 1910 and 1912 Congresses, I don't think there were Labor Party official, of that organization. But but the other point that's related in terms of position on the colonial questions and stuff, well, to some extent that's true. I think probably the worst resolution that was ever adopted by the Second International took place at the 1904 Congress, where the Fabian Society proposed, it was a short resolution on British India, and I think it might have been written by Heinemann. But basically it endorses, it condemns, the various colonial, evils and stuff. But at the very end, it endorses British rule of India. And, this was, put on the discussion, it was passed with no discussion and stuff, obviously, but so I think it's certainly, these things are certainly related. It's definitely related. The influence, the growth of opportunism within the Second International, really from in the years before, 1904, 1900, 1904, so forth. Actually, as Ben was making it, the struggle against, the opportunists, it really goes back all the time to the possibilists, and that'll be gone over in the book. But yes, and then that was, of course, those were the people that Engels didn't want to that was the reason why he didn't want to create a second version of the General Council for the Second International, because he was afraid the possibilists would take it over. I think, on the, I wanted to, the point that Alan's was raising on, which I think is an extremely important point. And there's several different things. Is there a dichotomy between the Second and the Third International? Yes, yes, of course there is. The Third International grew out of the Second International. It broke with that, it split. And it had, different norms and so forth. But at the same time, there's, as with the Marxist movement, there's also lines of continuity too. And the best of the resolutions of the Second International were incorporated into the Third International without question. And to the, even if they, for various reasons, they didn't attribute some of these different ideas for reasons we've talked about. Which is why our, the point about, recreate, is it right to try to recreate the Second International? No, I don't think, I know that there's a lot of people who think that. The Kautsky debate that Eric Blanc and other people, raised, and that was, what should be the goal of left-wing working class activists, revolutionary, should it be to go back to to a type of a movement of the Second International at the time today, or and it's the question of Kautsky's legacy that some of us have been involved in, that Ben's been involved in, and really clarifying these things. It's extremely important, and it's important to be precise. Which is, yes, it's, I would be opposed to recreating the Second, and that's exact. And the whole point is, unless should we cede this legacy? Should we cede the best of what Kautsky wrote? Should we cede the best of the Second International resolutions? Should this go to those people who have a reformist agenda and are trying to recreate the Second International on that ground? No, I don't think so. So which is what, where the point of taking a look at this history accurately, assessing what it is there that's worth understanding, internalizing, and utilizing. I think that's our job, and that should be the way we look at these various historical questions. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Is there anybody else wants to speak? I'm just looking, someone's asking, Gabby's asking about your book. I'm just copying, see if I can copy it into the chat. There we go. Copy and paste the comrades to have a look. There. Okay, is that it?
No.
No, probably not the right one. The book coming out in the spring you're asking about, that's about past books there. I've just pasted about past books. What's your book, Mike, coming out in the spring?
Under the Socialist Banner, Resolutions of the Second International, 1889 to 1912.
Under the Socialist Banner, that's the main line, isn't it? Yeah, and it's the resolutions, okay. Okay, there you go, Gary. All right. Well, there's no one indicating, unless I'm mistaken, and we've had 2 hours worth of fun. So I think we should call it a day. Thanks very much, Mike. That's great. Sorry, your friend John Riddle wasn't here, I think, was he? So there you can clap. Okay, silent applause. And we're here next week.